It's strange how some scandals fade quietly, disappearing into the background until the public barely remembers they ever happened. But Prince Andrew's situation never behaved that way. Instead, it has this unnerving rhythm to it, almost like something thrown out in frustration but circling right back around. That boomerang effect became the one thing even royal experts now agree on. No matter how many attempts are made to bury the past, the story refuses to stay down. People close to the palace quietly admit they hoped removing his titles and stripping away the last pieces of his official role would finally end the noise. They thought once the consequences were handed down, the pressure would ease and the royal family could shift attention back to their public duties. But that hope didn't last long, because almost immediately after Andrew lost his style, title, and honors, more conversations started bubbling up. More files resurfaced, more reporters began digging, and more politicians demanded answers. The wave didn't calm, it rose again, and before anyone could process the fallout, Andrew was dealt another blow. The formal notice demanding he surrender the cast iron lease to his 30-room home at Royal Lodge, a home he believed was guaranteed to him for life, locked in airtight legal terms. Yet even that wasn't enough to protect him. The pressure surrounding his connection to Jeffrey Epstein became so heavy that even pieces of paper stamped, "If you love real, respectful royal updates, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to UK Celebus. Your support keeps these stories coming." With royal authority suddenly felt flimsy. The palace wanted distance, and they wanted clarity. The days where Andrew could simply hide behind tradition, protocol, and bloodline were gone. But the most unsettling part wasn't the loss of titles or the looming eviction from Windsor. It was the growing sense that the crisis never reached its final chapter. Vanity Fair's Katie Nichols said what many insiders were already whispering, that there could very possibly be more allegations waiting to surface. Her tone wasn't dramatic. It was matter of fact, almost resigned, as if she knew the story had too many cracks to ever stay sealed. And she wasn't alone. Royal biographer Robert Jobson added another layer when he suggested the scandal spiraled as badly as it did because Andrew didn't tell the full truth to his mother or to King Charles. That single sentence carried a quiet pun, because if that's true, it means the palace made major decisions in the dark, reacting to details they weren't given, while Andrew hoped the storm would fade before anyone noticed the missing pieces. It creates this eerie sense that inside the royal walls, long before the public learned anything, there were already uneasy questions. Maybe that's why the scandal built momentum instead of losing it, because whenever something didn't match up, whenever testimonies conflicted or timelines looked to polished, it triggered another round of scrutiny. Every unanswered question became a vacuum pulling new revelations forward. And just as the palace began adjusting to the fallout, the drip feed of information started again. Journalists combed through documents that were once overlooked. Commentators re-examined old statements from the palace. People began noticing inconsistencies in Andrew's past interviews, especially his claim of cutting ties with Epstein after learning the truth about his crimes. The problem is, new emails suggested a different story. Those emails, released by US Congress, hit like a fresh wave. Epstein casually calling Andrew great fun, recommending him as someone worth meeting. The tone was light, almost friendly, and that was the problem. Because these messages were dated in 2010 after Epstein's first conviction, after the world already knew he had pleaded guilty, after Andrew insisted he severed the connection. It didn't prove wrongdoing, but it made his version of events feel incomplete. And incomplete stories always trigger curiosity. Meanwhile, senior royals were fighting a different battle. The monarchy was navigating a fragile transitional period after the Queen's passing, and public trust was something they needed more than ever. Yet the Andrew situation made that harder, because the scandal didn't just affect him, it threatened the entire institution's image. Every headline, every revelation, every resurfaced detail created new ripples the palace now had to manage. And while all this unfolded, Andrew tried to maintain some piece of normalcy. Recently, he resurfaced riding through the grounds of Windsor Castle with a female companion. The tension on his face in those images didn't go unnoticed. Katie Nichols even joked that he was likely getting in as many rides as possible before he's forced to leave. If you love real, respectful royal updates, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to UK Celebus. Your support keeps these stories coming. Leave Windsor behind. And that gesture him on horseback looked like a man clinging into the last familiar part of his life before stepping into a future he never imagined. But while he kept writing, the world kept talking. Giuffre's posthumous book surfaced his name once again, stirring the waters even further. U.S. lawmakers called for him to testify. Commentators pointed out how unprecedented it would be for a member of the British royal family to be questioned in an American political setting. And still, the story continued to evolve. What made everything even heavier was the idea that Andrew might have shielded details from the Queen, the one person who stood by him longer than anyone expected. Jobson implied that if the palace had known everything from the very beginning, the situation might have played out differently. That revelation didn't just cast doubt on Andrew, it cast doubt on the decisions made by the monarchy in his defense. And through it all, the public watched the tension between duty, legacy, accountability, and family loyalty. If you love real, respectful royal updates, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to UK Celeboo's. Your support keeps these stories coming. Unfold in real time. Because no matter how long Andrew stayed silent, the scandal kept breathing, and each time it seemed ready to settle, something new pulled it right back into the spotlight again. But what happened next pushed the story into even deeper territory. Not because of another headline, or a leaked photo, or a resurfaced interview, but because of a pattern, one that royal observers had quietly noticed but never publicly connected. It began with a set of meetings, closed-door briefings inside Buckingham Palace, meetings that, according to one senior aide, should never have been necessary, and should never have happened so late. These were crisis meetings, but not the kind held after a scandal breaks. These were meetings to determine how to untangle one, because by this point, the palace was no longer trying to protect Andrew. They were trying to protect the monarchy from Andrew, and that shift, subtle, strategic, and absolute, became the turning point. Inside the palace, every royal has what staff privately call a put-aside file, the dossier of past controversies, risks, vulnerabilities, and issues that could become a PR disaster under the wrong conditions. Most royals have thin ones. Prince Andrew's was not thin. It was heavy, and according to insiders, several items in that file had been flagged years before the public ever heard a whisper, not criminal allegations, but behavioral patterns, questionable friendships, and concerns raised by senior courtiers who worked closely with him. One insider described it like this: Andrew was always the grenade. Epstein was simply the moment the pin finally slipped. That characterization stunned even seasoned observers. If you love real, respectful royal updates, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to UK Celeboo's. Your support keeps these stories coming. Because it implied something the palace rarely allows, that a royal problem wasn't sudden, it was predictable. And if predictable, then preventable. Well, the public focused on Meghan, Harry, William, Catherine, and the ongoing modern royal narrative. Something else had been happening behind the scenes. Charles and William had formed a quiet, unbreakable front. Not on everything, but on one point, Andrew could never return. Not temporarily, not in a limited capacity, not ever. Sources say Charles was firm. William was firmer. William reportedly told advisors, "We cannot build the future around the past." Strong words, especially when the past referred to his own uncle. And while Charles was sympathetic to family, William was focused on the institution. He had watched for years as Andrew pulled oxygen, credibility, and stability away from the crown. He would not allow that to continue. This private father-son alignment meant that even as Andrew lobbied privately, hoping for a gradual re-entry through charity events, military ceremonies, or even a single public appearance, the door was already locked from the inside. The world didn't know it, but there was an attempted trial balloon. A small, low-risk, carefully controlled test. A private charity event. No cameras, no press. Just a handful of guests. Andrew attended, and according to an attendee, it was uncomfortable from the moment he walked in. People froze. Conversations paused. The room changed temperature. And despite the lack of journalists, news still reached the palace within hours. The message was blunt. He is not ready. The public public is not ready, and we may never be. That single event quiet, unreported, unacknowledged was enough for the palace to officially close the door on Andrew's return. While the world argued about TV interviews, Netflix documentaries, and public statements, another layer existed behind the scenes, a comprehensive legal and reputational review of Andrew's status. This document, described by insiders as clinical and sobering, evaluated Andrew's ties, vulnerabilities, exposure risks, public sentiment, and long-term consequences for the monarchy. The most shocking conclusion wasn't about guilt or innocence, it was about perception. The report summary, according to a source familiar with its contents, said his public presence would impose irreversible damage to His Majesty's reign. Regardless of future legal outcomes, this wasn't about justice. This wasn't about fairness. This wasn't even about Andrew as a person. It was about survival, the monarchy's survival. And so, the palace made a decision that would have been unthinkable even a decade earlier. Andrew was not just stepping back. He was being retired quietly and permanently. The moment everything crystallized reportedly came during a meeting between King Charles and Andrew at Balmoral. Sources say Andrew arrived hopeful, even confident, carrying documents and proposals to justify a limited return. Charles listened patiently. If you love real, respectful royal updates, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to UK Celebus. Your support keeps these stories coming. Calmly as a brother. But he answered as a king. Times have changed, he said. Expectations have changed. The monarchy must change. It was the kindest possible way to deliver the harshest possible truth. One aide described it as devastatingly final. Andrew didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply asked one question. Is there truly no path back? Charles closed the folder between them. There cannot be. Those four words became the line Andrew couldn't cross, and the line Charles couldn't compromise. After that conversation, the palace entered a period of deep internal tension. Some family members were sympathetic, others were frustrated. A few believed the choice had come too late, but one sentiment was universal. The monarchy could no longer afford this shadow. Andrew was not just losing status, he was losing identity. No military titles, no patronages, no public role, no platform, no return. For a man who had lived his entire life within the power, privilege, and structure of royal duty, this was a new kind of exile, a quiet one, but an exile nonetheless. And yet, the story didn't end there. Because as the palace moved forward, something unexpected happened. Andrew began pushing back. Not publicly, not through the media, but through pressure, appeals, and conversations that made the palace very, very uncomfortable. And the question lingered in every corridor. What happens when a royal refuses to fade quietly? Andrew began pushing back. Quietly at first, soft conversations, late-night calls, carefully worded letters. But the push became noticeable, and then it became pressure. Not because Andrew believed he was owed a return, but because he believed he had been misunderstood, misrepresented, and in some ways abandoned. That belief, fair or not, became the center of a quiet storm forming inside the monarchy. And for the palace, that was the worst-case scenario. Because a royal who feels cornered is one thing. A royal who feels wronged is another. And a royal who feels both is unpredictable. It started with small gestures. Andrew attending family dinners more frequently, joining gatherings he previously avoided, positioning himself near senior royals in the hope that anyone might soften. Sources say that if you love real, respectful royal updates, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to UK Celebus. Your support keeps these stories coming. These dinners quickly became tense. One insider described the atmosphere bluntly. It was like sitting with a ghost who refused to realize he was dead. Not dead literally, but dead institutionally. A figure whose royal life had ended, but who continued trying to re-enter it as if the door had never been shut. Andrew wasn't rude. He wasn't confrontational. He was persistent, and that persistence made everyone uncomfortable. His presence became a reminder of the scandal, of the interviews, of the legal settlement, of the global headlines, of the consequences the monarchy would carry for decades. It wasn't hostility, it was tension, and a tension no one knew how to diffuse. What shocked the palace most wasn't Andrew's persistence. It was his new circle. Quietly, discreetly, Andrew had begun consulting a small group of advisors, PR specialists, former military allies, and at least least one legal strategist, people who believed Andrew deserved a structured path back into public life. Their argument was simple: if the public forgives celebrities for worse, why must a prince be punished forever? It was a flawed comparison, and the palace rejected it instantly, but it created something dangerous. Andrew now had encouragement, and encouragement can fuel hope. Hope can fuel action, and action, if miscalculated, can become crisis. The palace realized it had a new problem. Andrew was no longer passive. He was planning. Then came the moment that truly alarmed the monarchy. Andrew made direct outreach to several organizations he once patronized. Not through the palace, not through official channels, but on his own. Some charities were polite, some were silent. A few immediately notified palace officials, confused and concerned. One even asked, is he cleared to return? He was not even close. And his attempt to reconnect raised a frightening possibility. If one of these organizations welcomed him, even unintentionally, it could trigger a media storm, call the palace's authority into question, and create a narrative that the monarchy had lost control of its own members. For a family built on structure, hierarchy, and order, this was unthinkable. The palace moved swiftly. Andrew was quietly instructed not to initiate contact with any organization whatsoever. His advisors were told the same. The message was firm: stop immediately, but the damage was done. Senior palace staff now understood something they feared. Andrew was beginning to operate independently, and that made him unpredictable. There was one moment never reported, never leaked, that insiders say was the closest the royal family came to a true internal fracture. It happened at Windsor. According to a well-placed source, Andrew confronted a senior aide after being blocked from attending a semi-public event he believed he could participate in. Not a royal engagement, not a ceremony, a private event where several family members would be present. Andrew felt excluded, and this time, he let the frustration show. Witnesses described him as emotional, upset, and for the first time angry. He reportedly said, "I have given my life to this family. You cannot erase me." The aide responded with the official line the palace had rehearsed: "Your role has changed. It cannot return to what it was." Andrew walked out. The incident was logged. It was escalated, and it confirmed what everyone feared. He was no longer simply grieving the loss of his position. He was fighting it. Charles was torn. As king, he had to protect the monarchy. As a brother, he was witnessing someone he had known since childhood spiral into frustration, identity loss, and political helplessness. A senior source described Charles' emotional state as deeply troubled. The king reportedly said, "I cannot lose him, but I cannot save him because any public mercy, a small appearance, a soft gesture, a single event would be interpreted as the first step toward reinstatement." And that was impossible. Charles' duty mattered more than his guilt or grief, and Andrew's persistence was beginning to strain not only the palace, but Charles personally. If the king was conflicted, William was not. For the Prince of Wales, the issue was structural, not emotional. He saw Andrew as a threat to the modernization he was trying to build, a lingering shadow from a royal era the public no longer accepted. William reportedly told his closest team, "We cannot rebuild the institution while dragging its past behind us." His stance was not cruel, it was strategic. And if you love real, respectful royal updates, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to UK Celeboo's. Your support keeps these stories coming. Put him in direct, quiet opposition to Andrew's attempts to regain footing. It also put William in a delicate position with his father. Charles loved his brother. William loved the monarchy, and both loves could not exist peacefully in the same decision. Behind the walls of royal residences, lines began to form. Not conflict, not fights, but fatigue. Some believed Andrew had suffered enough. Others believed he had not yet faced the full weight of accountability. A few wished the story would simply disappear. But the unspoken truth was this: the family was not divided by feelings. They were divided by futures. Andrew wanted a past restored. Charles wanted a present stabilized. William wanted a future protected. And somewhere in the middle, the monarchy struggled to hold all three together. But the pressure was still rising, because while the palace tried to contain Andrew's efforts internally, something external was brewing, something the royal family could not control, predict, or silence. A new investigation, a new testimony, a new piece of evidence, or a new interview from someone connected to the old scandal, something was coming. And when it arrived, it would drag Andrew, the monarchy, and every carefully closed door back into the global spotlight once again. And when it arrived, it did not come gently. The new wave hit first with whispers, then with headlines, and finally with documents that were impossible to ignore. US lawmakers, growing increasingly vocal, called for Andrew to testify regarding his connections with Epstein. Republican Representative Thomas Massey publicly demanded a reckoning, suggesting that anyone tied to Epstein regardless of title or nationality should face accountability. The implications were stark. What had been a British crisis now became transatlantic. The monarchy's handling of Andrew was no longer an internal matter, it was under international scrutiny. Within the palace, this created a rare tension between strategy and optics. How could a royal household, historically insulated from such pressure, respond without appearing weak? How could they defend tradition while acknowledging the modern insistence on transparency? Every meeting, every memo, every private conversation now carried the weight of global judgment. Meanwhile, Andrew continued to cling to what he could control, his daily life, small freedom, and most notably, horse riding at Windsor. Photos surfaced of him riding quietly, often alone or with a companion, the tension on his face evident to anyone who looked closely. Katie Nichols suggested he was squeezing in as many rides as possible before having to leave Windsor. Symbolically, these rides represented the final vestiges of the life he once commanded, a ritual of freedom before a life defined by constraint. But the personal was inseparable from the public. Virginia Giuffre's posthumous book again raised Andrew's profile in headlines, reigniting questions about past interactions and the timeline of his distancing from Epstein. Careful phrasing was necessary, but the text nevertheless reintroduced Andrew to global scrutiny. The palace, ever aware of optics, braced itself. Any perceived misstep could spiral into another media storm, another boomerang incident that would pull the family back into controversy. Emails obtained by the US Congress also resurfaced, showing Epstein referring to Andrew as great fun, suggesting a casual familiarity long after Andrew claimed to have severed ties. While not proof of wrongdoing, these emails contradicted the narrative Andrew had publicly presented. They became a focal point for commentators and critics alike, adding fuel to the perception that his disconnection from Epstein had been incomplete or at least imperfectly executed. At the same time, the internal royal dynamics grew more complex. Charles, balancing duty and familial loyalty, remained conflicted. He needed to uphold the monarchy while managing his own personal grief for a brother caught in controversy. William, by contrast, focused purely on the institution, insisting that the past not be allowed to cast shadows over the monarchy's modernization. This subtle but persistent tension defined every decision about Andrew's public visibility, his remaining privileges, and the careful messaging that had to be maintained at all times. Andrew's attempts at re-intra-private meetings, informal charity visits, and low-profile social appearances were carefully monitored. Any hint of overreach prompted immediate intervention from senior aides, who reminded him, firmly but discreetly, that public life was no longer an option. It was exile in everything but name, no titles, no patronages, no ceremonies, no platform. Every privilege had been stripped or carefully circumscribed, leaving him in a quiet but highly visible limbo. Yet, despite the restrictions, Andrew refused to disappear entirely. His persistence, while quiet, remained undeniable. Every movement, every small appearance was analyzed, recorded, and interpreted. And while the palace managed each incident with discretion, insiders noted a creeping concern. Andrew was no longer simply a figure to be shielded. He was now a figure operating independently, capable of drawing the world's attention back at any moment. All of this created a unique strain on the monarchy, one that extended far beyond Andrew himself. His situation became a cautionary tale of how a single member's actions or perceived failures can reverberate through centuries of tradition, trust, and public expectation. The boomerang effect, which had first been noted as a curious metaphor, now felt literal. No action taken, no restriction imposed, could prevent the scandal from returning in some form. Ultimately, the question that remained and perhaps will continue to haunt the royal family is this: how much had Andrew truly revealed? And how much more might emerge if and when new evidence or testimony comes to light? The palace has acted decisively, stripping titles and privileges, controlling public appearances, and tightly managing narratives. But every insider acknowledges that one cannot